Andrea Leadsom, Leader of the House of Commons. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
So are you rejoicing, or are you hoping for a rather better deal in phase 2?
Well, I'm in the rejoice end of the spectrum. I think it's a significant achievement that the Prime Minister has had this week. And interestingly, I think people on all sides of the argument are now seeing that she is determined and is succeeding in making a success of leaving the EU.
Making a success, you say? Well, let's go through some of the promises that were made about taking back control. The first promise was, of course, taking control of our money. Why is it right to rejoice when 40 billion, say the British government, the EU suggests it'll be rather more than that, will be controlled by the EU for many years to come, and many Brexiteers believe we get almost nothing in return for that?
Well, let's be clear, that represents about 4 years of the UK's net contributions. So it is a period of time in which we will continue to contribute to the EU, but in return for which we will have an implementation phase that ensures continuity for citizens and for businesses, to make sure that as we leave the EU, we can do so in a way that really works for us, but also for the EU27, so that we can continue to be good friends and neighbours with them, at the same time as taking back control of all of those pledges that were made during the referendum campaign.
So we're buying, in effect, with our 40 billion, a certain period of certainty, a little bit more time for businesses to prepare. But of course, what we're doing in return for that is staying under EU rules. Now, the other bit of control we were promised, that we control our laws, well, we certainly won't control them until at least 2021.
Well, that's not right. As you know, Nick, we are, through the EU withdrawal bill, we're bringing all EU rules and regulations into UK law, again for certainty for businesses and citizens, so that the day we leave the EU, our rules and regulations look the same as those of the EU.
But the EU is very clear about this, isn't it? That in this transition period, we will be operating under EU, in effect, under EU rules, the rules of the internal market and the rules of the customs union.
But that is, in a sense, a truism, because as we remain with direct access to the single market and all of those aspects of the EU that we will have left during the implementation period, which is in the interests of our country, we will need to continue to meet those single market rules. But that's not the same as saying that we're not taking back control. We absolutely are. We will be out of the European Union, and as we get free of the implementation period, we will be in a position to make our own rules and regulations. And even during that transition period, we will be looking at free trade agreements, we'll be looking to the future. And that's what's so important for young people in this country, is to understand, you know, with the approach of a new industrial revolution, in all of the amazing new technologies, that Britain is at the forefront of that, and that we are able to seek to trade with other countries around the world.
Yeah, let's look to the future. Forgive me for interrupting occasionally. There's a bit of a delay on the line, which makes it difficult to avoid. One particular part of the future is very unclear indeed. The deal the Prime Minister signed promised full alignment with EU rules, not operating under EU law, but operating as if we were, shadowing, mirroring, if you like, in order to avoid a hard border between the north of Ireland and the south. Now, she promised it only in certain circumstances, but the promise is written in an international agreement. That would not really amount to taking control, would it? It would mean we were inside many of the rules of the EU, but without having any control over them.
I think that's been somewhat misunderstood. What the Prime Minister has made very clear is we will not have a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. We will ensure that we do everything possible to abide by the current free movement between goods and services in Northern Ireland and the Republic. And should it be, in the case that we do not achieve our absolute priority, which is a clear free trade agreement that encompasses all goods and services between us and the European Union, that there is, if necessary and in the unlikely event, then there is a fallback position that simply ensures that issues like the single electricity market between Northern Ireland and the Republic can continue to function well.
So you're saying this phrase full alignment that some people think is the equivalent of staying in the single market, you're saying this full alignment is not very important, won't affect many things and may not happen.
Well, our absolutely top priority
No,
is
let's just deal with full alignment, if we would. Let's deal with full alignment, because it's in the deal, and some people are hailing it. People who don't agree with you about this, they are hailing it as a guarantee of a soft Brexit, perhaps the back door to staying in the single market. Your government has signed up to this, so it's important that we work out what these words mean.
So you're pressing me on the third and least favourable of three options, but nevertheless it's right that we do look at all outcomes. And what I'm saying is that the entire United Kingdom will be leaving the single market and the customs union and the European Union together, and will have the same ability to make our own rules and regulations. But there are certain parts of the island of Ireland where it will be important that they continue to have alignment in such areas as I've just expressed.
But forgive me, Ms. Leadsom, you didn't say that. The government made very clear that there would be no new border between Northern Ireland and the UK. That, in other words, means the same rules must operate in the north of Ireland and in the United Kingdom as a whole. So if you promise full alignment, and that is the promise that's been made in certain circumstances, you are promising that it is potentially true that Britain will shadow the single market. Can't mean anything else.
Well, it certainly can. What we're talking about is certain parts of the arrangements between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, where there are currently no boundaries or borders, that it would be important, such as in the single electricity market, where they continue to have the same rules. In the third and least desirable outcome, that there is absolutely no free trade deal.
Yeah, you keep quoting the electricity market, but as you know, the big one is agriculture, and that would have a huge impact. Let's go on to what Michael Gove has said, because I don't want to make you feel that you need to repeat yourself. On the issue that Michael Gove has raised this morning, he suggested that if voters aren't happy with this deal, and it suggests that he thinks they might not be, some of them, that's fine. What they can do at the next election is order the next government to diverge further from the EU. Do you think that's a sensible way forward?
I think it's simply the case that in taking back control, in getting back our sovereign parliament, in leaving the EU, it will be for the voters to determine what future governments do. I think it is a statement of the obvious.
And yet what it would require is a new Prime Minister, because it is inconceivable that Theresa May would go into the next election saying, if you don't like the deal I've just done, please vote for me anyway and then I'll change it. That's not going to happen. It would mean a new Prime Minister.
Well, Michael Gove is entirely supportive. Let's be
clear.
But
that wasn't my question.
Forgive me. He was the first person to go on air supporting.
Sure, that wasn't my question. My question is, what does Michael Gove mean when he says to voters this morning, if you don't like the deal we've done, you can change it?
And I'm replying, I can't speak for what's in Michael Gove's head, but what I take from it is that it is the case that in future parliaments, should the whole United Kingdom decide on a particular direction, it will be within our powers, because we've taken back control, because we have left the EU, to be able to focus any future government in any direction that the UK voter wishes to do. And that is part of retaining, taking back control and regaining our parliamentary sovereignty.
When people in the south of Ireland conclude that this piece of paper wasn't worth the paper it was written on, if you're basically saying, look, we've promised you in certain circumstances full alignment, but don't worry, we'll rip that up, we'll get the voters to give us an order to do something completely different.
Well, you know, sovereign governments, are always in a position to undertake and then subsequently to make different arrangements should the will of the people be that they do that. I don't really see that this is getting us anywhere. It is the case in a sovereign parliament that the voters can choose to take a country in a different direction.
Understood. When you say it's not getting anywhere, bear in mind what I didn't raise it. It was Michael Gove raised it in an article in the Telegraph. Now let's talk about the future, which you're keen to do. The Cabinet is about to meet to discuss for the first time what the future relationship with the EU should look like. Do you, as a prominent leaver, want us to have a relationship which hugs the EU close, as the Chancellor does, or diverges and moves away, uses the freedoms that you fought for?
Well, I'm a big fan of regulatory equivalence, which basically means that we will seek similar outcomes, not always the same. I think in animal welfare there's a very good example of where we may choose, because of our commitment to the highest animal welfare standards, to take a different approach in certain areas to the EU because we feel that we would like to have higher standards of animal welfare. So similar outcomes, we're all committed to animal welfare, but we may choose to do it a different way. So I think it's perfectly possible to seek to retain that close collaboration, close agreements on trade, and at the same time for us to go our own way, and that's what I see happening in the future.
What do you say to people who still see this and think there are fudges that can't be resolved, and they conclude that leaving the EU will be a disaster for our economy and for the world and lead to a decade of economic and political uncertainty?
Well, I'm actually quite pleased to be able to tell you I had in my own constituency last night a quite lengthy question and answer session on leaving the EU. And what was really noticeable for me is that both people who voted leave and people who voted remain feel delighted with the outcome but slightly irritated because they didn't get everything they wanted.
Do you recognise those words that I've just quoted? It will be a disaster for our economy and world and lead to a decade of economic and political uncertainty. Andrea Leadsom's words just 4 years ago when you said leaving the EU would be a disaster.
Well, you know, let's be clear about that. I, like many people in this country, grew up under the European Union, very committed to it, looking at it as a free trade and a force for good. And certainly I did spend a lot of time assessing and analysing through a Fresh Start project that I worked on with a number of backbenchers.
You changed your mind,
and it really was, in the last few years, yeah, I mean, literally, when it became apparent that there was no fundamental reform necessary, and let's be clear, the EU since last June has gone in directions that the Leave campaign predicted, with things like prospects for an EU army, with certain EU commissioners talking about we want a United States of Europe. Those things were never for me.
Okay,
and so, yes,
I changed my mind
when the facts changed.
Well,
yes.
People look at your words and they may think if you can change your mind that easily, then you may change your mind or your optimism may be misplaced this time.
It was not easy, Nick.
Understood.
Absolutely
One
not
last
easy.
one on a different subject, if I may. It's the first time we've spoken to you for some time on this programme. It was widely reported that it was your words to the Prime Minister that ensured that the Defence Secretary, Sir Michael Fallon, had to resign, as you described something he'd said to you. Are you comfortable? Do you think that was the right decision?
Well, I don't comment on private conversations. It was never... I was absolutely not interested in discussing issues in public, and I was very sorry to see what was said in the press. That was not my intention.
But you think that people who have, been verbally abused, it is right to say so and right for the Prime Minister to act?
What I'm focusing on is chairing a working party on behalf of the Prime Minister to look at issues around harassment and bullying in Parliament. And I'm focused on making progress on that and actually seeking to change the culture so that we can, in Parliament, be amongst the best employers and the best regarded in the way that we treat each other. And you know, I, like many others, feel embarrassed and very sorry for those who have actually behaved badly in Parliament. And, you know, I've heard of many cases which are very troubling, and I'm determined that we put steps in place to make sure that can't happen in future.
If you're determined to change the culture, the expectation that is very widespread in Westminster that the effective Deputy Prime Minister Damien Green will resign in the next few days. Do you think that's likely?
You know, I think that is a matter for the investigation that's underway. And as I say,
it's a matter for him if he resigns.
The Prime Minister, well, indeed, but you know, there is an investigation underway which I'm not going to comment on. But the Prime Minister is absolutely clear that she wants to see a Parliament where all people treat one another with respect. And I'm working to come up with a cross-party agreement on how we can achieve that.
Andrea Leadsom.